There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They knock on your door wearing the plain, unassuming clothes of a Tuesday evening, offering a familiar exchange, a casual transaction that you have completed a dozen times before. You open the door, expecting nothing more than the gentle click of a lock behind them as they leave, the quiet resumption of your solitude. But sometimes, the disguise slips. The ordinary moment holds its breath, and in the space between one heartbeat and the next, you realize that it is not a moment at all, but a threshold. And the person standing on it is not just returning a piece of borrowed clothing. They are holding out the key to a door you had long since resigned yourself to never opening. He was standing there, under the weak, buttery light of my apartment hallway, holding my favorite gray hoodie, the one with the paint fleck on the sleeve, and everything about the scene was painfully, achievingly normal. Except for the way he was looking at me. Except for the fact that he had already been gone for an hour, and had come back. We met in the water, a place where sound is muted and the world is reduced to the rhythm of your own body. It was the first week of freshman year, at the university pool, a cavernous space that always smelled of chlorine and damp concrete, a scent that for 4 years would be more familiar to me than any cologne or perfume. I was a distance swimmer, built for endurance, for the long, lonely meditation of a 5,000-meter set. My world was measured in the black line at the bottom of the pool, the steady churn of my arms, the metronomic kick of my legs. I found a kind of peace in that monotony, a quiet room inside myself where the noise of the world couldn't reach. Julian was the opposite. He was a sprinter, a creature of explosive power and blinding speed, all coiled muscle and ferocious energy. He didn't find peace in the water. He waged war on it, battling for every hundredth of a second. His races were over in a flash of churning white water and a roar from the crowd, while mine were slow, unfolding dramas that most people didn't have the patience to watch. Our friendship, therefore, should have been unlikely. We moved through the same space, but at entirely different tempos. On the pool deck, he was a sun, orbited by a dozen other swimmers, his laughter echoing off the tiled walls. I was a satellite in a far-flung orbit, content in my own quiet gravity. I watched him from a distance, the way one might watch a bright, beautiful storm from behind a thick pane of glass, in awe of its power, but grateful for the safety of separation. I had known, almost from the first moment I saw him shake the water from his dark hair, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he laughed at a teammate's joke, that I was in some kind of danger. It was a low, quiet hum of awareness, a magnetic pull I felt in my chest whenever he was near. It was a feeling I had learned early in my life to pack away, to store in a locked box in a distant room of my mind. It was easier that way, safer. But the thing about the grueling life of a collegiate athlete is that it strips you down. The 16 practices a week, the pre-dawn alarms, the exhaustion that seeps into your bones and makes your thoughts slow and syrupy, it leaves little energy for pretense. And in those moments of shared, bone-deep weariness, unlikely connections are forged. Our friendship began not in the bright chaos of the pool deck, but in the quiet liminal spaces around it. It started in the weight room, when he spotted me on a bench press without being asked, his voice a low murmur of encouragement that cut through my fatigue. It grew on the long bus rides to away meets, where, after the rest of the team had succumbed to the drone of the engine, we would talk for hours, our voices hushed in the dim light. He would speak of his family, his dreams of becoming a software engineer, the pressure he felt to be the best. And I, who rarely spoke of myself, found myself telling him about my photography, about the way I saw the world through a lens, trying to capture the quiet, overlooked moments of beauty. He listened. That was the most disarming thing about him. For all his bright, outward energy, Julian possessed an incredible capacity for stillness when he was with me. He would turn his body towards me, his gaze focused and unwavering, and it felt as if the entire world had narrowed to the space between us. He made me feel seen, not as the quiet, slightly awkward photographer on the swim team, but as myself. And in those moments, the lock on that box in my mind would begin to feel flimsy, the hinges groaning under a pressure I was terrified to acknowledge. I kept my feelings for him a secret, a delicate, glass-blown thing I protected with every ounce of my self-control. It was a silent, one-sided covenant. I would be his friend, his confidant, the calm harbor in his often stormy life, and in return, I would be allowed to stay close to him, to orbit his light without getting burned. It was a painful arrangement, but the alternative, a life without him in it at all, was unthinkable. We built a life around this unspoken agreement. Our friendship became a defining feature of our college experience. We were Leo and Julian, an inseparable, if slightly odd, pair. We studied together in the library, our silence companionable and deep. We ate most of our meals together in the loud, clattering dining hall, creating a small bubble of calm in the chaos. His girlfriends, and there were a few over the years, bright, cheerful girls who seemed to fit so perfectly into his world, came to understand that I was part of the package. I was always polite, always friendly, and always felt like a ghost at the table, watching him be the person he was with them, a slightly different version of the Julian I knew. I learned the art of the gracious retreat, of knowing when to fade into the background, leaving them to their easy, uncomplicated intimacy. And every time a relationship ended, he would appear at my dorm room door, a look of quiet devastation on his face, and I would let him in. We wouldn't talk about it much. Instead, I would put on a movie, or we'd play video games, or we'd just sit in silence, and I would let my presence be a balm until he was ready to be the sun again. I photographed him constantly. It was my only permissible outlet, the only way I could safely express the depth of what I felt. I have hundreds of images of him from those years. Julian, laughing, head thrown back, sunlight catching in his wet hair. Julian, asleep on the bus, his face soft and vulnerable in the blue twilight. Julian, staring down his lane before a race, his entire being humming with a terrifying, beautiful intensity. I never showed him the best ones, the ones that were too honest, the ones where my feelings were so clearly etched into the silver gelatin of the print that it felt like a written confession. Those I kept for myself, tangible proof of the thing I could never say aloud. They were my secret history of us. He was my greatest subject, and he never even knew it. The shift began subtly, as most seismic changes do. It started not with a tremor, but with a change in atmospheric pressure. After graduation, we both ended up in the same city, a sprawling metropolis that was both thrilling and deeply alienating. I found a small studio apartment and a job assisting a commercial photographer, spending my days in the dark and my nights wandering the lonely streets with my camera. Julian, true to his ambitions, landed a high-pressure consulting job at a prestigious firm. His life, which had always seemed so effortless from the outside, suddenly became a frantic scramble. He was working 80-hour weeks, living off caffeine and ambition, trying to prove himself in a world far more brutal than a 50-meter pool. His relationship with Sarah, his college girlfriend who had moved with him, began to fray under the strain. I heard it in his voice during our infrequent phone calls, a new weariness, a brittle edge that hadn't been there before. The sun was beginning to dim. He and Sarah broke up about 6 months after the move. It wasn't a dramatic, explosive end, but a slow, quiet erosion, a death by 1,000 tiny neglects. He told me about it over the phone, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, as if he were reciting a stock market report. He said it was mutual, that they both knew it was coming, that it was for the best. But I knew him better than that. Julian didn't know how to be alone. His entire life had been structured around teams, relationships, a constant hum of other people. Solitude was a foreign country to him, and he had just been unceremoniously deported there. That Friday, he called me around 10 at night. "Hey," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "You busy?" "Just developing some film," I replied, my own voice softer than I intended. "What's up?" There was a long pause on the line, filled with the distant sound of city traffic. I don't want to be at my apartment tonight," he finally said. "It's too quiet. Sarah took the last of her stuff today." The admission hung in the air between us, heavy and fragile. It was the first crack in his carefully constructed armor. My heart ached for him, a deep, painful throb of empathy, and something else, something I refused to name. "My couch is free," I said, keeping my tone even, casual. "It's not much, but it's not quiet." He was there in 20 minutes. He looked wrecked. His hair was a mess. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his expensive work clothes were rumpled, as if he'd been wearing them for days. He didn't bring a bag. He just walked in, looked around my small, cluttered apartment, at the stacks of photo books, the cameras on the shelf, the prints hanging on the walls, and seemed to deflate, a long, slow sigh escaping his lips. He sank onto my worn-out sofa without a word. I didn't press him. I just made him a cup of tea, the way I used to after a particularly brutal practice, and put on a familiar movie, one of the sci-fi epics we had watched a dozen times in our dorm room. Halfway through, I glanced over and saw that he had fallen asleep. His head had slumped to the side, resting uncomfortably against the arm of the sofa. He looked younger, the harsh lines of stress on his face softened in slumber. Every instinct in me screamed to be careful, to maintain the safe distance I had cultivated for years. But I couldn't just leave him like that. I rose quietly and retrieved the thick quilt from my bed. As I draped it over him, my fingers brushed against his cheek. His skin was warm. He stirred slightly, a soft murmur escaping his lips, and then settled deeper into the cushions. I stood there for a long time, watching him breathe in the dim, flickering light of the television, my heart a frantic, trapped bird in my chest. This was new territory. A border had been crossed, quietly and without fanfare, and I had no map for what lay on the other side. That night became the first of many. It started as a Friday night thing, a post-work ritual. Julian would text me, "Long week. Couch available?" And I would always say yes. He would arrive, shed the skin of his corporate life at my door, and collapse into the relative peace of my apartment. He claimed my place was more comfortable, that his own apartment felt sterile and empty, like a hotel room he was just passing through. I never questioned it. I simply accepted his presence as a new fact of my life, a complication I was willing to endure because the alternative was unbearable. I told myself I was just being a good friend, the same friend I had always been. It was a lie, of course, a paper-thin defense against the truth, but it was all I had. The ritual began to evolve, its boundaries slowly expanding, creeping into the fabric of our lives. One evening, he arrived shivering, caught in an unexpected autumn downpour. I gave him a dry towel and my favorite gray hoodie, the thick, soft one I lived in on weekends. He pulled it on, and the sight of him in my clothes did something strange to my equilibrium. It was an act of profound, unconscious intimacy. The hoodie, which was loose on my slender frame, fit him perfectly, stretching across his broad shoulders. He looked right. He looked like he belonged there. He wore it for the rest of the evening, and when he left the next morning, he was still wearing it. He texted me later, "Forgot I had this on. I'll bring it back next week," but he didn't. The hoodie became a permanent fixture in his life, a piece of my world that he carried with him into his own. Soon, he had a small collection of my clothes. A sweatshirt here, a t-shirt there. He'd forget them, or say he'd wash them and bring them back, but they simply migrated from my closet to his. My apartment started to smell faintly of him, his deodorant mingling with the chemical scent of my darkroom chemicals. And his apartment, he once admitted, smelled like me, like the laundry detergent I used. He said it helped him sleep. He said it with such casual, unthinking innocence that it nearly broke my heart. For him, it was about comfort, a simple, tactile solution to his loneliness and stress. For me, it was a slow, exquisite torture. It was the ghost of a life I desperately wanted, a domesticity I could only ever pretend to have. The couch soon became insufficient. One particularly cold night, after a pipe burst in his building and left him without heat, he asked, his voice hesitant, if he could possibly share my bed. He promised to stay on his side, that he was just desperate for warmth. I remember the frantic hammering of my pulse as I agreed, my voice a strained whisper. That first night was agonizing. I lay perfectly still on my edge of the mattress, hyper-aware of his presence beside me, of the warmth radiating from his body, of the soft sound of his breathing in the dark. I didn't sleep at all, but he slept like a stone, and in the morning he thanked me with a groggy, grateful smile, completely oblivious to the turmoil he had caused inside me. The pretense of the broken heater was soon forgotten. Sharing my bed became the new normal for the nights he stayed over. The boundary between us and the bed began to dissolve, eroded by sleep and exhaustion. He was a restless sleeper, and he would often migrate in the night, seeking warmth. I would wake up in the pre-dawn gloom to find an arm slung over my waist, or his head resting on my shoulder, his breath warm against my neck. In those moments, suspended between sleep and waking, I would allow myself to feel it. I would let the warmth of his body seep into mine, and I would pretend, just for a few stolen minutes, that this was real, that this wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding, but a choice. Then, as the sun began to rise, I would carefully extricate myself, sliding out of bed before he woke up, retreating behind my walls before the reality of the day could shatter the fragile illusion. I lived in a state of constant, low-grade anxiety, a tightly coiled spring of hope and fear. Every touch, every shared silence, every lingering look was a piece of data I would analyze endlessly in the solitude of my darkroom. I was a detective searching for clues, trying to assemble a coherent narrative from a series of ambiguous events. Did he mean to brush his hand against mine? Was he looking at my lips? Or was I just imagining it? Was this just what friendship looked like to him? A deep, platonic intimacy that I, with my secret, forbidden desires, was twisting into something it wasn't? The uncertainty was eating me alive. I was losing my grip on the careful line I had drawn between us, and I was terrified of what would happen if I fell. He was building a home in the ruins of my self-control, and he didn't even seem to realize he was holding a hammer. The worst part, the most beautiful and painful part, was how gentle it all was. There was no aggression, no overt demand. It was a slow, quiet erosion of boundaries, driven by his unspoken need and my unspoken willingness to meet it. He would come home from a brutal day at work, his face etched with a tension that made him look 10 years older, and he would simply find me on the couch and lay his head in my lap. I would instinctively run my fingers through his hair, the way one might soothe a child or a frightened animal, and I would feel the tension slowly drain out of him. He would sigh, a sound of profound relief, and sometimes he would fall asleep right there. In those moments, the world would shrink to the weight of his head on my thighs, the soft texture of his hair under my fingers, the quiet rhythm of his breathing. And in that small, fragile world, there was a peace so profound it felt like a prayer. But it was a borrowed peace, a temporary truce in a war I was slowly losing with myself. I tried to pull back, to rebuild the walls. I would make excuses, a deadline, a friend in town, a cold, to try and put some distance between us. But the moment I tried, I would see a flicker of hurt, of confusion, in his eyes, and my resolve would crumble. He needed me, and I, God help me, needed to be needed by him. My life had become a paradox. The source of my greatest joy was also the source of my deepest anxiety. I was living in the quiet, terrifying space between a friendship I was desperate to keep and a love I was terrified to lose. I was drowning in the space he created around him, a silent, slow-motion surrender to a current I could no longer fight. I was watching the life I wanted play out as a pantomime, a dress rehearsal for a play that would never open. And then came that Tuesday evening. He had been gone for a few days, on a work trip to Chicago. My apartment had felt cavernous without him, the silence roaring in my ears. I had spent the time trying to recalibrate, to find my old equilibrium. I told myself that when he got back, I would set new boundaries. I would insist he take his hoodies back. I would reclaim my bed, my space, my sanity. He had texted me from the airport to say he was back and would drop by later to return the gray hoodie he'd taken with him. It was a simple, logistical message. I prepared myself for a brief, friendly exchange at the door. I would be firm. I would be clear. He arrived around 8. He looked tired from the flight, but he was smiling. He held out the hoodie. "Here you go," he said, freshly laundered. "Thanks," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. I took the hoodie from him. The fabric was warm, smelling of a generic hotel laundry service, but underneath it, I could still faintly smell him. Our fingers brushed during the handoff, a spark of static electricity in the cool evening air. I took a half step back, ready to say goodnight, to close the door and begin my new regime of self-preservation. But he didn't move. He just stood there in the doorway, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket, his gaze fixed on me. The hallway light cast long shadows on his face, making it hard to read his expression. "Everything okay?" I asked, the silence stretching into something uncomfortable. He nodded, but it was a slow, uncertain gesture. "Yeah, it was a weird trip." He looked past me, into the warm light of my apartment. "It was the first time in months I slept in a bed by myself." He said it quietly, as if he were confessing a secret. "I didn't sleep well. My carefully constructed walls began to crumble. The speech I had prepared about boundaries and space dissolved on my tongue. All I could see was the exhaustion in his eyes, the vulnerability he was only ever willing to show me. You can come in, if you want," I heard myself say, the words feeling like a betrayal of my own best interests. He gave me a small, grateful smile and stepped inside. I closed the door behind him, and the soft click of the latch sounded like a gavel of final judgment. He didn't move towards the couch. He just stood in the small entryway, looking at me with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. The air between us was thick with all the things we had never said, all the lines we had blurred. It felt like the moments before a storm breaks, a heavy, electric stillness. All the analysis, all the fear, all the second-guessing of the past few months seemed to be converging on this single, terrifying point in time. He was looking at me not as a friend, not as a roommate, but as something else. And for the first time, I didn't see innocence or obliviousness in his eyes. I saw a question, and I think he saw the answer in mine. "Leo," he said, his voice barely a whisper. It was the way he said my name, with a weight, a significance it had never held before. He took a small step closer, closing the already negligible space between us. I could feel the warmth of his body, smell the faint, clean scent of his skin. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, a wild, panicked rhythm that seemed to fill the entire room. This was it. The threshold. The moment where the disguise falls away and you are left with the raw, terrifying truth of things. He was not just returning a hoodie. He was returning for something else entirely. And I was completely, utterly unprepared for what that might be. He just kept looking at me, his eyes searching my face as if he were trying to read a map in a foreign language. The silence was a living thing, expanding and contracting with each of our breaths. My entire world had shrunk to this small patch of floorboards, to the space between his body and mine. All the rational thought, all the carefully constructed arguments for self-preservation had evaporated. I was left with only a feeling, a terrifying, exhilarating freefall. He had walked me to the edge of a cliff, and I was finally realizing that I had been wanting to jump the entire time. I could see the conflict in his face, the war between years of ingrained habit and a new, dawning awareness. It was the same war I had been fighting internally for years, and seeing it reflected on his face was both a vindication and a terror. "I think," he started, his voice cracking slightly, and he had to stop to clear his throat. "I think I've been really stupid." He wasn't looking at me anymore, but at the floor, at our feet, which were only inches apart. It was the most vulnerable I had ever seen him, more so than after any breakup or failed race. This was a different kind of nakedness. He was stripping himself down to the core, and he was terrified of what I would see. "Stupid how?" I managed to ask, my own voice a reedy thing, a stranger's voice. He finally lifted his head, and his eyes were glistening. "About this," he whispered, gesturing vaguely to the space between us. "About you. I've been taking so much. Your space, your clothes, your time. I've been using you as a crutch, a safe place to land. And I never stopped to think about what that was doing to you, or what it meant. For me, the honesty of it was a physical blow. He saw it. He finally saw it. He understood the imbalance, the strange, one-sided nature of our arrangement. I braced myself for the apology, for the gentle but firm friend-zoning. "I'm so sorry if I gave you the wrong impression." I braced myself for the end. But that's not what he said. He took another step, and his hand came up, not to touch me, but to hover in the air just beside my face, as if he were afraid I might shatter. "The whole time I was in Chicago," he said, his voice gaining a sliver of confidence, "I kept thinking about how much I hated it. Not the work, but the nights. The hotel room was cold, and I realized it wasn't about the temperature. It's because you weren't there. I couldn't sleep because my brain kept telling me something was wrong, something was missing, and it was you. Every word was a revelation, a key turning in a lock I didn't even know existed." He wasn't apologizing. He was explaining. He was confessing. The frantic bird in my chest stilled, replaced by a slow, powerful beat that resonated through my entire body. Hope, terrifying and brilliant, began to dawn in the dark corners of my heart. He finally let his hand rest on my cheek, his thumb stroking my skin so gently it was barely a touch. His skin was warm, a little rough. It was the most deliberate, intentional touch he had ever given me, and it felt completely different from all the accidental, sleepy brushes in the night. This was not an accident. This was a choice. Leo, he whispered again, his eyes pleading with me to understand. Would it be okay? He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The question hung in the air between us, shimmering and fragile. Would it be okay if I kissed you? Would it be okay if I changed everything? Would it be okay if this was real? I couldn't find my voice. I could only nod, a single, jerky movement that felt like it took all the strength I had. That was all the permission he needed. He leaned in slowly, giving me every possible chance to pull away, to stop him. But I was rooted to the spot, caught in the gravity of his approach. His lips met mine with a gentleness that undid me. It wasn't a passionate, desperate kiss like in the movies. It was hesitant, searching, and deeply, profoundly tender. It was a question and an answer all at once. It tasted of airplane coffee and mint, and beneath that, just him. It was a kiss that felt like coming home. It lasted only a few seconds, but when he pulled back, the entire geography of my world had been redrawn. The old maps were useless now. We were in a new country, and neither of us knew the language. He rested his forehead against mine, our breaths mingling. His eyes were closed. Okay, he breathed out, a single word that sounded like both a discovery and a surrender. Okay, I whispered back, my hand coming up to cover his on my cheek. And in that moment, the fear was gone. The anxiety, the years of secret pining, the careful performance of platonic friendship, it all washed away, leaving behind only the quiet, stunning certainty of his hand on my face, of his lips on mine. The threshold had been crossed. The door had been opened, and the room on the other side was quiet and warm and filled with a light I had only ever dreamed of. The morning after was a study in jarring silence. I woke up slowly, drifting to the surface of consciousness with a feeling of deep, unfamiliar peace. My first thought was of him. I turned my head, expecting to see him beside me, to find that the dreamlike quality of the previous night had solidified into the reality of a new day. But the other side of the bed was empty. The sheets were cool. A feeling of cold dread, sharp and immediate, pierced through the warm haze of sleep. I sat up, my heart beginning to race. His shoes were gone from the entryway. His jacket was no longer slung over the back of the chair. He was gone. There was no note. Just the lingering scent of his shampoo on the pillowcase and the gray hoodie, which I had dropped on the floor, lying in a heap by the door. I picked it up, the soft cotton a poor substitute for the warmth of his body. The quiet of the apartment, which had once been my sanctuary, now felt oppressive, accusatory. The silence was filled with my own racing thoughts, a chorus of doubt and self-recrimination. I had misread everything. It had been a mistake, a moment of lonely, post-travel confusion for him. I had let him cross a line, and in the harsh light of morning, he had panicked and fled. I had been a fool to believe, even for a few hours, that it could be anything more. I had ruined the most important friendship of my life for a single, gentle kiss. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a text from him. My hands were shaking as I read it. Morning. Sorry, had to run. Early meeting I forgot about. Talk later. The words were clipped, impersonal, devoid of any of the tenderness of the night before. Talk later. It was a vague, non-committal promise, the kind of thing you say when you have no intention of talking at all. The cold dread in my stomach solidified into a hard, aching knot. He was avoiding me. He was building the walls back up, higher and thicker than ever before, and he was leaving me on the outside. The day stretched before me, a vast, empty expanse of time that I had to somehow survive. I spent it in a fog, replaying every moment of the last 12 hours, torturing myself with the what-ifs and the should-haves. I went to my darkroom, the one place I could usually find solace, but the familiar smell of chemicals only made me nauseous. The red safe light felt menacing, painting the room in the color of alarm. He didn't talk later. Not that day or the next. My texts to him, casual, carefully worded attempts to feign normalcy, went unanswered for hours, and when he did reply, it was with brief, evasive sentences. Swamped at work, totally exhausted, catch up soon. Each message was a small, polite stone added to the wall he was building between us. The ritual of our weekends, the easy comfort we had built, was shattered. Friday came and went with no text from him asking if the couch was free. The silence from his end was a deafening roar in my life. I felt like I was grieving a death, the death of our friendship, and the ghost of what I thought we might have become was haunting every corner of my apartment. The loneliness was a physical ache. I had grown so accustomed to his presence, to the rhythm of his life intersecting with mine, that his absence felt like a phantom limb. I found myself listening for his key in the lock, even though he didn't have one. I would make too much coffee in the morning out of sheer habit. I wore his favorite of my hoodies, the gray one, not for comfort, but as a kind of self-flagellation, a reminder of what I had lost. The pain was sharpest at night, lying alone in my bed, the space beside me feeling like a vast, cold emptiness. I had survived for years on the crumbs of his affection, and for one brief night, I had been offered the whole loaf. Now, I was starving. After a week of this agonizing silence, I couldn't take it anymore. The uncertainty was worse than any confirmed rejection. I needed to know. I needed to hear it from him, even if it was the worst possible news. I needed to close this chapter so I could begin the long, painful process of healing. I texted him, my fingers clumsy and trembling. "Can we please talk? I'll come to you." This time, the reply was almost immediate. A single word. "Okay." Walking to his apartment felt like walking to my own execution. His building was one of those new, sterile glass towers that all looked the same, a place without history or warmth. It was a perfect reflection of the life he was living without me. When he opened the door, he looked as terrible as I felt. He was pale, his eyes were bloodshot, and he hadn't shaved in days. His apartment was immaculate, but it felt cold and unlived in, like a showroom. There were no personal touches, no clutter, none of the comfortable chaos that defined my own space. It was the apartment of a man who was never home. He didn't invite me in, just stepped aside to let me pass. We stood awkwardly in his living room, the space between us charged with a tense, miserable energy. I was the one who had demanded this confrontation, so it was up to me to speak first. "Julian," I began, my voice quiet but steady. "What happened? What is this? You can't kiss me like that and then disappear. If it was a mistake, just tell me. I can handle it. But the silence. I can't handle the silence." He wouldn't look at me. He stared at a point on the wall just over my shoulder, his jaw tight. "It wasn't a mistake," he said, his voice low and hoarse. The words hung in the air, a contradiction to all of his actions. "Then what was it?" I pressed, my frustration mounting. "Because disappearing for a week feels a lot like you think it was a mistake. It feels like you regret it." He finally met my gaze, and his eyes were filled with a raw, desperate confusion that mirrored my own. "Of course I don't regret it," he burst out, his voice louder now, laced with anguish. "Leo, it was the first thing that has felt real to me in months. Maybe years." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure distress. "That's what scares me." "Scares you how?" I asked, my own anger softening as I saw the genuine torment he was in. "What are you so afraid of?" "Everything," he exclaimed, starting to pace the room like a caged animal. "I'm afraid of this, of what this means. I'm afraid of what my family would say, what my friends would say. I'm afraid because my entire life, I've had this plan. This picture of what my future was supposed to look like. College, job, girlfriend, wife, house in the suburbs. It was all laid out. And you don't fit in that picture, Leo. And it terrifies me that you're the only thing I want." His confession knocked the wind out of me. It was all there. The fear, the confusion, but underneath it all, the undeniable truth. He wanted me. He was just terrified of the implications. He had spent his whole life being the golden boy, the sprinter who always won, the son who always met expectations. He didn't know how to deviate from the script. "So you'd rather be miserable, living in this empty apartment, working a job that's killing you, just to stick to some imaginary plan?" I asked, my voice laced with a sadness for him. "You would rather lose me, lose us, than risk not being the person you think you're supposed to be." He stopped pacing and looked at me, his expression crumbling. "I don't know," he whispered, and he looked so lost, so utterly broken, that my last vestiges of anger dissolved, replaced by a wave of protective affection. "I don't know how to do this." I closed the distance between us, and, for the first time, I was the one to initiate the touch. I placed my hands on his arms, forcing him to look at me. You don't have to know, I said softly. We can figure it out together. Or we can figure it out apart. But you have to make a choice, Julian. You can't keep me in this limbo. It's not fair. I would rather have you as just a friend than live like this. But I need to know what we are. I was laying all my cards on the table, offering him an out, a return to the safety of our old friendship, even though the thought of it was a knife in my gut. He stared at me, his eyes searching mine, and I could see the battle raging within him. It felt like an eternity passed in that silence. Then, slowly, he covered my hands with his own, his grip tight, anchoring. I don't want to go back, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I can't. I'm scared. I know, I said, and my own voice was shaky now. Me too. And with that simple admission, the tension in the room finally broke. He pulled me into a hug, a desperate, clumsy embrace, burying his face in my shoulder. I held him tightly, feeling the tremors that ran through his body. He was still terrified, still confused, but he had made a choice. He had chosen me, over the plan, over the fear. He had chosen the unknown country, and he was asking me to be his guide. We stood there for a long time, just holding on to each other in the cold, impersonal living room, two scared people finding a small, fragile anchor in a storm of uncertainty. It wasn't a perfect, fairy tale ending. It was a messy, terrifying, and beautiful beginning. The days that followed our confrontation were quiet and tentative. We were like two people learning to walk again after a long illness, unsure of our footing, testing our balance with each careful step. There was no sudden, dramatic shift into a perfect relationship. Instead, we began the slow, deliberate work of building something new from the ground up, on a foundation of honesty instead of unspoken assumptions. We talked. For the first time, we truly talked, not just about our days or our work, but about our fears, our histories, and what we wanted this new, undefined thing between us to be. Julian spoke of the immense pressure he'd always felt to conform, to be the person everyone expected, and how that pressure had nearly suffocated him. I spoke of my own loneliness, of the years I had spent loving him in silence, guarding my heart behind the walls of our friendship. It was painful and awkward and incredibly liberating. Each confession, each shared vulnerability, was a thread we used to stitch ourselves together, creating a new tapestry that was stronger and more honest than the old one had ever been. He started staying at my apartment again, but it was different now. There were no more pretexts, no more plausible deniability. He was there because he wanted to be with me. We would lie in bed, not always touching, but just existing in the same space, the quiet presence of the other a profound comfort. The physical intimacy returned slowly, organically. It started with him reaching for my hand while we watched a movie, his fingers lacing with mine, a simple, declarative gesture that spoke volumes. It progressed to him falling asleep with his head on my chest, his breathing a steady, reassuring rhythm against my heart. The hoodies became a shared wardrobe, a symbol of our new domesticity. I would find him in the morning, making coffee in my kitchen, wearing one of my old t-shirts that was too small for him, and the sight would fill me with a quiet, bone-deep happiness that I had never known was possible. He started bringing things over to my apartment, integrating his life with mine piece by piece. A toothbrush appeared in my bathroom. A few of his books found their way onto my shelves. His laptop was often open on my coffee table. My small, solitary space began to transform into a home for two people. It was no longer just my sanctuary, it was ours. I saw a new side of him, a softness and a stillness that his old life had never allowed. He started to relax, the perpetual tension in his shoulders easing. He laughed more, a genuine, unburdened sound. He took an interest in my photography, asking me to explain the developing process, watching with fascination as an image slowly emerged in the chemical bath in my darkroom. One evening, I showed him the box, the one where I kept the photos of him from college, the ones that were too honest to show anyone. I was nervous, my hands trembling as I lifted the lid. He sat beside me on the floor, and we went through them one by one, in silence. He saw it all, the years of my unspoken adoration, captured in silver and light. When we reached the last one, he didn't say anything for a long time. He just picked up a print, a candid shot of him sleeping on the team bus, the afternoon light tracing the curve of his cheek, and looked from it to me, his eyes full of a wonder and a sadness I couldn't quite decipher. "You've loved me for a long time," he said, his voice thick. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said simply. There were no more secrets to keep. He leaned over and kissed me, a slow, deep kiss that was full of regret for the time we had lost and gratitude for the time we had found. "I'm sorry it took me so long to see it," he whispered against my lips. "To see you." We began to build a life in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together. It wasn't a loud or dramatic love story. It was quiet and steady and real. It was lazy Sunday mornings with coffee and books. It was him holding a reflector for me on a photo shoot. It was me rubbing the tension from his shoulders after a long day of work. It was the simple, profound peace of knowing you have found your person, the one who sees you and loves you not in spite of your complexities, but because of them. The door to my apartment was now firmly closed to the rest of the world, not to hide, but to protect the sacred, quiet space we were building within its walls. The gray hoodie still hung in the closet, no longer a symbol of longing or borrowed comfort, but just another piece of a shared life, a simple garment imbued with the warmth of two people who had finally, against all odds, found their way home. We learn, I think, that the most important journeys are not the ones that take us to new places, but the ones that bring us back to ourselves. We spend so much of our lives building walls, creating carefully curated versions of who we are supposed to be, that we forget the shape of our own hearts. And sometimes, it takes another person, standing on our doorstep with a borrowed piece of ourselves in their hands, to remind us. They hold up a mirror, and in their gaze, we finally see the person we were always meant to be. Our love story wasn't a sudden fire. It was a slow thaw, a gradual turning towards the light. We didn't fall into it. We grew into it, nurturing it with patience and honesty and the quiet courage it takes to let yourself be truly seen. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together, finding in each other not a solution to our loneliness, but a partner in it, a shared solitude that was, in the end, the most profound kind of company.